Hello. I've had this video sent to me by several people. It's seemingly from a writer who hopes to improve other people's world-building abilities, and the topic he covers here is revolutions. A quick cursory glance at the video revealed the usual liberal presuppositions and complete unawareness of the ideology that permeates his assumptions and conclusions. Please don't bother this guy, he's well-meaning, he just hasn't been recommended the relevant books. Let's take a look.
Revolutions face a choice. Imagine you're from a small, economically unstable country without much international influence, and after weeks of protests and violent clashes with the state, with hundreds of people left dead in the streets, you've just overthrown a brutal dictatorship which has held power for decades. You've promised the people jobs, equality, human rights, democracy, and now you've got to deliver. The question is, what next?
Firstly, economically unstable and internationally uninfluential don't go together. The reason these nations, think the Congo for example, are economically and politically unstable is usually because of the consequences of colonialism, the subsequent attempts at maintaining the impoverishment of the country for imperialist means, to maintain global conglomerate or otherwise foreign capital control over crucial natural resources, or to keep raw outputs cheap and easy to dominate. I made a video on the topic here if you're interested for a deeper dive. Furthermore, clashes and protests over weeks aren't how revolutions happen. These are movements that build for months, years, decades, and sometimes even centuries, with a particular case in Cuba or the USSR. As for the promise of jobs, equality, and all the rest, well, let's not look too much further than the American example to see his liberal presuppositions defeated, but we'll touch on all this soon. Regardless, the track record of post-revolutionary societies is pretty decent. See the oft-cited Physical Quality of Light paper or Albert Szymanski's work on the topic.
The military swears to, well, quote, protect the revolution, but you don't know how much you can trust them, and even though you worked with some extremist radicals to overthrow the dictator, can you really rely on them now? They want some pretty bad stuff. Your new regime needs money to survive, and all of these other rich countries are scrambling, eyeing up your oil reserves. Breaking ties with any of these people might see the death of the revolution, but keeping them around might destroy it too.
Over most revolutions, the military was either connected to the political movement itself, in the Burkina Faso example, or won over, as in the Soviet example, or otherwise fought and defeated in the Cuban and Chinese examples. The missing point here is this confusion about the term revolution. He seems to think that coups are revolutions, despite the propagandistic use of the term. The mass line definition is pretty solid and covers the most important point, which is the overthrow of one social class by another. Without objective definitions, you can't really get anywhere. The extremist radicals wanting some pretty bad stuff is honestly the epitome of liberal thinking. It's nebulous and entirely focused on loaded language. What does that even concretely mean? It's a nonsense phrase. Unsurprisingly, this makes for bad writing. As for breaking ties with so-called wealthy countries, it's alright, they're usually the first ones to break ties themselves, impose sanctions, sponsor paramilitary groups that aim to support their material interests in your country, or outright invade. He goes on to discuss the Arab Spring in Egypt, and makes a semi-correct point on the masses of people who are on the street losing momentum as a result of a lack of unity, which is an incredibly common and frankly tired Marxist analysis point, with the boring but effective solution of doing diligent party work, which was not done in the example of Egypt. And finally seems to have missed the many suspicious inconsistencies in the removal of Morsi from power, but this is a conversation for another time.
Ideological disagreement is especially poisonous for revolutions, given revolutions tend to attract people of more radical ideologies, be it political extremism, religious extremism, or ethnic extremism. Stalin used the power struggle between Bolshevik leaders over smaller and smaller ideological issues to throttle the revolution and marginalize his competition till he ended up with autocratic power.
Ideological disagreements are dangerous depending on the circumstances, and are dangerous for all movements regardless of their form, even in so-called liberal democratic ones. That's why the Overton window is so narrow all around the West, as clearly evidenced by the events currently ongoing in Palestine. The strange extremism angle is one of perspective too, mostly. Rampant free market ideology is very extreme if you think about it, and you can check out my video on neoliberalism to learn more here. But it's never really considered so otherwise, again as a result of ideology and zero critical thinking. His overview of Stalin and other Bolshevik considerations regarding collectivization or industrialization as smaller and smaller ideological issues shows how he has no real idea what he's talking about, or at least fails to grasp the weight of these events and decisions, something that can affect the economic future of a, at the time, mostly peasant-based nation of over 100 million people isn't a minor ideological issue. About the autocratic power bit, please refer to the CIA's own words on collective leadership, or modern research on things as benign as family law within the USSR, which reveals it had a different yet still democratic character, or Pat Sloan's book on the topic, or 1,000 other resources. We really should graduate from Cold Warrior talking points at this rate. It's not 1965 anymore. That aside, why isn't rampant market liberalization a radical ideology to this guy? Generally, why is every other system radical and fringe, ooh, scary, but not whatever you happen to live in? He's trying to write, so why doesn't he actually interrogate what he believes so that he can write something actually well thought out and believable? The answer is ideology, obviously, but the rhetorical questions are just emphasizing that point. Back to the video in just a second. Let's hear from today's sponsor, Atlas VPN. For a lot of research that I do for my videos, I end up hitting pages that aren't available in my location. That's frustrating, as you can imagine, geo-restriction really does suck, but not with Atlas VPN. For those unaware, a virtual private network makes all of your internet traffic travel through an encrypted tunnel. This way, it protects you from spying, public Wi-Fi dangers, and hides your IP address and your online activities. It even allows you to change your location for all your researching needs. Developed by top cybersecurity specialists and IT engineers in 2019, Atlas VPN was created to make the internet accessible and secure for everyone. Currently, it has more than 6 million users worldwide and boasts the best VPN deal on the market. Right now, there's a fantastic Christmas special. So, what are you waiting for? Go down to the description and click that link, use my code Hakeem, and get a 3-year subscription for just $1.70 a month with 6 months extra on top. But that's not all. You get blazing fast speeds for streaming or gaming, unlimited protection for all your devices, an inbuilt ad and malware blocker, and you'll get to save some extra cash as Atlas VPN will find you the best deals online from everything from your online subscriptions to airlines, hotels, and more. Have a private Christmas and a safe New Year with Atlas VPN Premium. You can have all of this for just $1.70 per month plus 6 months for free with a 30-day money-back guarantee. Click that link in the video description below and grab this Christmas deal right now. Massive thanks to Atlas VPN for the sponsorship. This is what allows me to pay my editor fairly, so the support is highly appreciated. Alright, back to the video.
In a transition period like revolution, people need to have faith in the institutions and political system like democracy that they're supposedly meant to hand over power to. But if they don't think that they can achieve their aims, what they revolted to do through that new system, even something like democracy, why would they give up power to it?
This is childish political analysis. He seems to see only individuals, not movements or class and material basis. You currently live in a dictatorship of the bourgeois class, a system exercised by the people who own all the factories, land, capital, resources, etc., etc. In most Western countries, through a cleverly set up system of parliamentary democracy, or a similar setup, which makes it all but impossible to effectively resist the dominance of capital and the supreme political power of the capitalist class. The bourgeoisie of the imperial periphery has parallel motives but different approaches at times. Regardless, the world is overwhelmingly in favor of an end to the fighting currently ongoing in Palestine, and a solution that favors the Palestinians. But all these supposedly democratic nations are going against their populations by supporting the illegal occupying entity through arms, diplomatic support, unabashed cover in the press, and everything else. If you truly believe you live in a democratic system where you can effect real and meaningful change at any manageable rate, you're naive and wrong, and this is backed up by research. If you think you can replace the rule of capital by a rule for and by working people through these parliamentary measures, you're just silly and need to learn from history. My friend over on Second Thought has a great video on capitalist democracy here.
Disagreements breeds gridlock, gridlock breeds collapse, and collapse breeds chaos and war, and we're back on that cycle, half measures and civil unrest once more.
This is avoided through something Marxists call democratic centralism. In a sentence, diversity in discussion but unity in action. You lay out your plan and ideas before everyone in a council or party or other voting body. Everybody discusses extensively, and then afterwards you all vote on which course of action should be taken. Afterwards, the entire group has to be bound by that democratic will of the majority once a vote is passed. That's where the centralism part comes in. This avoids the slightly unnuanced example of disagreement to gridlock to collapse he mentioned. That example also slightly lacks the larger nuance of sabotage, civil war due to disenfranchised class elements, foreign destabilization, sanctions, etc., etc.
Revolutions are important forces in society, forcing change in static, often terrible systems, but beating the dictator is only the start, and they've got a long way to go before they're really successful.
It's not surprising his ideas aren't that well developed given he's using fiction as his historical guide, seemingly, but beating the dictator isn't why revolutions happen, nor are liberal democracies immune to revolution. Strange that he worded it this way, but it betrays his presuppositions, I guess. He goes on to talk about Hunger Games, okay. Talks some more about factionalism in a very superficial way and mentions ethnic strife as a possibility before launching into this brain rot.
This is kinda what happened with Stalin as well. Despite the revolution's aspirations of a democratic, liberal, socialist republic, ideological disagreements led Stalin to slowly concentrate power in himself, using the chaos of the post-revolution world to eliminate competition and undermine the role of the Soviets till it was just him. The ideological disagreement prevented the perhaps more popular other factions from working against him, and his rule was a simpler way out of the chaos.
Democratic Liberal Socialist Republic is not a coherent political sentence. Democratic for whom? Yes, democracy can serve certain class interests and isn't an objective and non-discriminatory process, so you have to ask for whom. Liberalism and socialism are diametrically opposed on a foundational basis, which we cover on the podcast if you're interested. Did he miss the Union and Soviet, meaning Council, bits of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics name? Stalin didn't rise to the position most associated with him till 1928, and this is ignoring that he held several different posts at different points, but that's never mentioned because they don't want to have any serious analysis of this figure. Regardless, 1928 was not during the chaos after the revolution, but quite a bit after it had settled down. Furthermore, we already discussed this weird centralization bit as if Stalin was some omnipotent demigod, but that's what passes for writing political fiction nowadays apparently. By the way, the map is only Russia. I don't know how he missed this. The USSR covered from Belarus and Ukraine to Central Asia. How do you make this mistake when you're speaking so confidently about this stuff? I know it's not the concrete subject matter, but still, do better, man. This is basic 8th grader geography and modern history. The eliminating the role of the Soviets is also incorrect. Please refer to the thousands upon thousands of pages written on the Supreme Soviet, the Soviets of nationalities, the local, regional, city, and lower Soviets, etc., etc. The book titled The Soviet Form of Popular Government goes into nauseating detail if you're interested in learning more. I fell asleep reading it, so that should tell you quite a bit. This idea is genuinely just a holdover from Cold War era unsourced nonsense. Every time you see a modern source on this, it in one way or another links back to hyper-ideologized garbage from the 70s with no real academic merit. Were there deficiencies? Of course, but to claim the Soviets were just a rubber stamp is as reductive and myopic as saying the US Congress or the House of Representatives exists solely as a rubber stamp. About the perhaps more popular other factions, yeah, they didn't exist because of a ban on factionalism earlier by Lenin, but even with the unofficial factions that formed, they were beyond minuscule. The 15th Congress of the CPSU records 724,000 votes in favor of the program proposed versus 4,000 for the opposition. So much for more popular, I guess.
But it's not just ideological disagreement. The elite and powerful will often join a revolution in hopes of gaining something else, power or money or position.
He continues to misunderstand the position of ideology here. The elite and powerful, usually meaning the capitalist class and those that gained from supporting it prior to the revolution, cannot just simply join a socialist revolutionary movement. A revolution, let's remember, is the overthrow of one class by another. Otherwise, all you have is a coup, and that's what the so-called elites can join. In this case, yeah, you can pull this tired rules for rulers first-year political science student nonsense, but you're not writing much that's compelling world-building-wise if you're going this route.
When the Soviet Union fell, Russian oligarchs saw a huge opportunity to seize state assets and make a ton of money. And that's a huge motivator. You know, they don't ever care for pesky things like human rights or the vision of the revolution. It's about getting a better position from a world falling apart.
The aims of the revolution. There was no revolution. The Soviet Union was illegally and undemocratically dissolved by 3 guys in a room on an afternoon, and the express purpose was that immense theft of state assets. Also, he's showing footage of the fall of the Berlin Wall here, not the illegal dissolution of the USSR, again, basic historical literacy. I made 2 videos on the topic that I recommend you check out if you're interested here.
And the question is, these elites, the powerful, the rich, what happens when they don't get what they want? How does the revolution survive without their support, without their money, without their men, without their resources?
The revolution is usually done in spite of these people, not with their backing, unless it's not a proletarian, meaning world-class revolution, but one of different sections of the ruling class against each other. This is a frequent occurrence in fragile junta versus fragile liberal democracy, as was common in Latin America in the previous century, or Turkey also in the previous century. I kind of feel bad because this dude is just a writer trying to help others in world building, but he seems to not have done the reading required to get a proper image of history and how things happen aside from seemingly what other bits of fiction have already depicted and whatever he's internalized from the most pedestrian liberal sources.
money, people, aid from other countries, and all too often this comes in return for trade guarantees, access to resources for their own security interests, i.e. the entire Cold War in Korea, Vietnam, Angola, Afghanistan, Nicaragua, Mozambique, Ethiopia, Lebanon, and a myriad across South America. Over and over, Western powers have stifled communist revolutions with sanctions and blockades and sabotage, preventing them from integrating with the international community.
An actually nuanced and accurate point. Very nice. Let's hope he doesn't mess it up.
I'm not saying we shouldn't sanction North Korea, but it is what has been happening for decades, and the United States has been strangling Cuba for a long time.
Why? Why should we, quote-unquote we, an implicit identification with the Western economic and socio-political bloc, sanction the DPRK or anybody else? What gives them the right? If you want to write a nuanced work of fiction, you'll logically show the motivations of both sides, which historically, and especially in this instance, are savagely rational. Writing a nation or character or villain as simply crazy is dogshit writing unless they genuinely have a valid psychiatric diagnosis as part of the plot, and even then it's just lazy. I made a dedicated video on the DPRK, which you can check out here. TLDR, bombing everything, killing millions, then consistently threatening a nation militarily while also sanctioning it and trying to bring about its downfall and the death of its population through famine, is an unsurprising recipe for heightened military spending and the development of defensive capabilities. Also, you're not sanctioning anybody. The same ruling class that orders sanctions on poor imperial periphery nations foreign capital cannot dominate and penetrate into also likewise impose austerity measures at home, cutting all your public services, gutting healthcare, and giving tax breaks and stimulus packages to those who need them least, mostly their wealthy buddies. Some class consciousness would go a long way in this so far very liberal world building being peddled.
Revolutions put countries in really vulnerable positions. They're piss poor, disorganized, they don't have the institutions or logistics that the other regime might have had, and they're struggling not to slip back into chaos. And in that environment, other countries come looking for concessions and guarantees. Following Libya's revolution at the same time during the Arab Spring, France sent oil companies to secure oil reserves that they could not get access to under Muammar Gaddafi. French Foreign Minister at the time, Alain Juppé, even said it was, quote, fair and logical that those who supported the revolution would get access to its oil, pressing their claim.
See, this is where a critical eye should be used, but is sadly lacking. It wasn't a fledgling grassroots revolution that ousted Gaddafi and then went knocking on France's door. It was an artificial movement created, funded, and armed by Western capital with the explicit goal of overthrowing the political and social system which gave Libya the highest living standards in Africa for the sole purpose of privatizing Libyan natural resources for the profits of a select few. He goes on to deliver a very US high school overview of nearly 30 years of Chinese history in 15 seconds, moves on to discussing the implementation gap between the stated goals of the revolution and what the revolution is actually capable of delivering, based on manpower, infrastructure, etc., basically more world building, and then seems to think post-revolutionary societies build using tax money, for some reason. And then, finally, says this.
This is also why there's a tendency for revolutions to devolve into dictatorships rather than democracies. Democracies are complicated systems. They require a robust and sophisticated bureaucracy to work.
I think I don't even need to comment on the segment. His choice of footage really does all the speaking.
A newborn revolution still needs to keep the people who keep them in power happy, and that can lead to some pretty toxic relationships with the military, with the church, with oligarchs, with the wealthy, with other countries even. The big difference is that stable democratic governments are self-sustaining, they're self-sufficient, they don't need to rely on oligarchs or the like to keep them going. At least you'd hope so, and you can actually say the same of like a stable monarchy or whatever.
All of the institutions or groups he listed are usually forces that lead coups, not revolutions. Semantics, sure, but still this is relevant even for writing if you want to be able to grasp good narrative abilities, even for character propaganda purposes if you would want to try that. Furthermore, liberal democracies are definitely not self-sustaining or self-sufficient. American political campaigns are almost exclusively driven by the hyper-wealthy, corporations, and other entrenched interests. You can have the entire weight of the US population behind you, but if the ruling establishment and the segments of capital they represent do not want you running, then you won't run or won't succeed. Case in point is Bernie Sanders in the US or Corbyn in the UK. And that's for the ones they don't kill or depose, like Allende or Mossadegh. Most liberal democracies nowadays are practically the very definitions of oligarchies, almost entirely relying on corporate and wealthy institution support, and this is by design. You also gotta love his random inclusion of a stable monarchy, whatever that means.
In 2019, a poll found 59% of Russians felt the Soviet Union, quote, took care of ordinary people, and 66% regretted its dissolution. In 2012, 38% of Armenians said their country, quote, would always need a leader like Joseph Stalin. And I spoke about this in previous videos, but people will idealize the past.
Yeah, majorities across all former socialist nations have that trend. They all fundamentally understand that the lie sold to them by capitalism was just that, a lie. The systematic decline of economic growth, population, infrastructure, and public service quality, social benefits, social guarantees such as employment in your field and cheap staple goods, these are things that directly affect people's quality of life, unsurprisingly. When those are gutted, defunded, or entirely abolished, no wonder people feel this as a decline. To pretend this is just romanticizing the past is ignorant because people saw and experienced this decline firsthand. It happened almost overnight in the Soviet Union. My video on the depopulation of Eastern Europe goes way deeper into this point, so check that out. His at times smug dismissiveness in light of his general ignorance of the topics he's covering is a very tiring liberal trait. Educating yourself and questioning your biases is not a sin, my guy. Maybe interrogate why those polls could possibly say that. Think and contrast this with why, for example, former colonies rarely feel this way about colonial rule. I could go on. The thing is, it wasn't just Russians. Ukrainians, Belarusians, practically all of the Caucasus and Central Asia. Every population by majority within the USSR felt represented and benefited from its social system because it was a system made to privilege the working class. Szymanski's Human Rights in the Soviet Union is a great read on this if you're interested. He's incredibly nebulous with the flip side of what he's trying to say here, but the only thing I can assume is the deportations during World War II, but by proportion of population, those weren't representative of any large segment of Soviet society, even if they were large mistakes. Anyways, this stands in stark contrast to the 1950s US, which was very good to white Americans but very bad for African Americans and other minorities. This is a much better example of his certain segments benefit more than others point, but he conveniently doesn't make it.
Post-Soviet countries often struggled in the wake of the revolutions and the USSR's dissolution. The transition to a market economy often meant gutting social services and a downturn economically for a time, especially when it came to pension systems. See, the USSR had a sophisticated and very generous pension system that was a lot higher and often a lot better than what we see today. So people who benefited from or worked for that were very attached to it, and reasonably so, right?
Downturn economically for a time. Have you looked at the stats? This is the third time I'm plugging my depopulation of Eastern Europe video, so just take a look there, but safe to say this is incredibly selective phrasing, let's just put it that way. He goes on to lay out an actual material reason for the continued popular support of the USSR, only then to just completely ignore it and throw his hands up in the air like, I guess it just was nostalgia. Finally, there's more world-building stuff after this, again reproducing liberal analysis by keeping things as individual and person-based rather than more overarching social movements, class interests, or things that merit some sociological depth. After a summary, the video just ends. I kinda regret making this video and writing up the script and everything. I just feel like I repeated myself. He's using political and historical examples to help people write books, but reproducing liberal analysis devoid of any deeper substance just makes for bad writing. Opaque, shallow characters, crappy world building, just generally more boring fiction slop no matter how interesting the original idea was. He has several other videos along these lines, but I doubt I'll look into them unless people really want me to. Anyways, if you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon, it really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you to Nitro Dubs, Kenny, Thomas Roberts, Nicholas, Owen Baker, T. Wood, Dr. Lemonman, Lumix, Charlie and Eric, Ultimate Turin, Daniel Ethel, The Generic Guy, Santiago Pereira, Rain, Cassandra Corvus, David Fries, Confuse M, Mariana Mastusovic, Robbie Richardson, and Masay Kadro. Thanks for watching.